we're in the month of April, which is the year that, in the month that Earth Day was founded in 1970. It's a little past Earth Day, it's post Earth Day, but we decided to do some special things around Earth Day, that theme. And Rachel Carson's work, particularly her work on Silent Spring, is very relevant today on Earth Day, 50 years after that book was published. And it produced a firestorm of protest from the chemical industry when she first published this book. They went after her with every weapon they could to discredit her. And in fact, President Kennedy created a science advisory committee to look at her work and to see if it was credible. And they confirmed that her work and her concerns about chemicals in the environment and the effect that those chemicals were having on wildlife and potentially human beings was correct, and those concerns were correct. So now, 50 years later, and Earth Day way back in 1970, what kind of progress have we made in all those decades? Well, we've made some progress, and we know more about the human body and how it relates to some of these toxic chemicals, the effects on the endocrine system and the development of particularly unborn children and in young people. But we also find that our government has not become much more effective anyway in governing what kinds of chemicals get into the marketplace. So we're very inventive people, and that's wonderful. And we invent new chemical compounds that can do particular things for us that are important to us, but sometimes and oftentimes they're not tested sufficiently, and when products are made with those chemicals, we become the guinea pigs because they haven't been studied in a laboratory with rats. We end up being the laboratory for some of those toxic chemicals. And that's still the case. So who knows in 20 or 30 years what we'll discover as science continues to move forward around the various illnesses that we see today in our children and in adults.
Just to set the context, at this time of her life, Rachel Carson is suffering from cancer. She's only going to live another year after the Silent Spring has been published. And so she'll speak to that, and I won't try and speak for her. But it's a very touching period of her, of course, career. She was well known for The Sea Around Us, and that was published in 1953. She was a marine biologist who, from her earliest years, wanted to be a writer. And she was able to combine her enthusiasm for writing with her marine biology and scientific inquiry nature. And when she did that with The Sea Around Us, it became a bestseller. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 86 weeks and translated into 28 languages. So that was in '53. 9 years later, she was well acclaimed and known around the world and invited to give talks and lectures and all that sort of thing. And then Silent Spring comes out, a very different story. And again, invited to be visiting all around the world, but by then she was too physically ill to travel. She said, well, gee, here I am getting invited all around the world and I really can't go. But she did finish the work. It took her 4.5 years, and she'll describe that in this 18-minute piece of film. And after the film's over, I'm going to introduce the panelists, our 3 panelists, and we're going to start with Dr. Deborah Rice and have a PowerPoint that brings us into contemporary discussion about what's going on with chemicals in the environment. And then we'll move to our other panelists, and that'll be about 15 minutes or so per person. So when that's done, we're going to open up for questions and discussion. Does that work? And we're going to hold questions until then so that we don't get ourselves too digressed and not finish our work tonight. Okay? So we're taping this with Cable Television Network, which is a local Cable 5, and we hope to use this film footage of this evening on our site and share it with other sites so that the audience multiplies like fishes and loaves.
I'm trying to write a speech I'm giving next week. But I read an article this morning that so annoys me, I'm having difficulty concentrating. It was an editorial written by a senior editor from Newsweek, comparing me to Senator Joseph McCarthy and accusing me of stirring up the latent demons of paranoia. I've been called so many unpleasant things this last year, you'd think I'd be used to it. I am. But there's often this initial irritation at the stupidity. Hopefully by tonight I'll find it amusing, add it to my list of other favorite quotations on Carson. Here's the chemical industry's chief spokesman. Rachel Carson doesn't write as a scientist, but as a fanatic defender of the cult of the balance of nature. Her book is more poisonous than the pesticides she condemns. And Time magazine. Many scientists sympathize with Miss Carson's love of wildlife, even with her mystical attachment to this balance of nature. But they fear that her emotional and inaccurate outburst in Silent Spring may do harm by alarming the non-technical public. From Crop Life, the business paper for the farm chemical industry. If man were to faithfully follow the teachings of Rachel Carson, we would return to the Dark Ages, and the insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth. I'm feeling better already. You should have seen the reviews for Silent Spring. The book actually offended a relatively small segment of our society, but a very rich one. The chemical and other related industries, such as food processing, and the federal government's immensely powerful Department of Agriculture. To these formidable foes, I am a publicity problem to be dealt with by any means at hand. Lawsuit, slander, you name it. Of course, the attacks are not pleasant, but they don't really get to me. The difficult part for me was writing the book, and that's done with. Do you remember my saying that the subject chooses the writer? Silent Spring's a perfect example. I didn't want to write it. I was planning a book on children and nature based on Roger. And out of the blue, I received a letter from an old friend, Olga Huckins, about an aerial spraying of DDT, which had devastated her Massachusetts bird sanctuary. She wrote in detail about the death of the birds, how they had died horribly, each in the same way, with their bills gaping open, their splayed claws drawn up to their breasts in agony. The mosquitoes, the reason for the spray, remained, but the grasshoppers, visiting bees, other harmless insects were all gone. Olga hadn't wanted her property sprayed to begin with, and now the state was proposing to spray it again. She wanted help. Had she no rights under our laws to protect her own land and a sanctuary from poison? Her letter obviously concerned me. And I set out looking for any information that might help. I found other similar cases. Livestock that had been poisoned, milk that had been tainted, bee colonies destroyed, whole watersheds contaminated. There was a growing body of evidence showing that we were causing massive destruction to wildlife, to plant life, even endangering human life. In eastern Florida, they were trying to eliminate the sand fly. 2,000 acres were treated with dieldrin, one of the most violently poisonous hydrocarbons, 5 times as toxic as DDT. After the spraying, the State Board of Health surveyed the area and reported that the effects of the dieldrin on the life of the water had been catastrophic. Everywhere, dead fish littered the shores. No species was spared. The crustaceans were exterminated, the entire crab population destroyed. 1,175,000 fish were killed immediately. They weren't trying to eradicate the fish, only the sandfly. In Lansing, Michigan, there was a study linking the death of the robin population to the spraying of the elm trees. The elms, which were being treated for Dutch elm disease, were sprayed in the spring and again in July with 2 to 5 pounds of DDT per tree. The poison killed the insects, good and bad, and formed a film over the leaves and the bark that could not be washed away by rain. In the autumn, the leaves fell, and as they decomposed, the earthworms fed on them, accumulating and concentrating the DDT in their bodies. Some of the earthworms died, but those that survived became biological magnifiers of the poison. In the spring, the robins returned, and they ate the worms. 11 large earthworms can transfer a lethal dose of DDT to a robin. A robin can eat 11 worms in as many minutes. Not all the robins ate a lethal dose, but the few that survived were unable to produce a single living offspring. How did we get to this? I think until very recently, the average citizen assumed that someone was looking after these matters, that some little understood but carefully relied upon safeguards stood like shields between his person and harm. We're experiencing a rather rude shattering of those beliefs. The more I read, the more alarmed I became. I decided I would write an article. I couldn't find a magazine that would publish it. They were afraid of losing their advertisers, many of whom were connected to the oil companies or their satellites, the petrochemical companies. Well, if a magazine article couldn't be published due to advertising restraints, then a book would be written. It was really quite simple. Except I wasn't going to write it. My mother was ill. She was dying. Roger had been with me less than a year. He needed all of my attention. I didn't have the time to commit to anything more than an article, and I didn't want to. A book about pesticides would be a book about poison and death. I want to write about life. So I contacted other writers, each well qualified for the task. They didn't want to write it any more than I did. E.B. White's refusal was the hardest. I was certain he would be the one. He could have found a style that would have reached everyone. I didn't know what to do. All that was clear to me was that the information had to get out. People had no understanding of the risks they were being asked to take. It was only my years as a government biologist that had taught me about these chemicals. They are non-selective poisons. They had only been used during wartime and for the emergency control of insects. They had never been tested for large-scale agricultural use. And yet, within 12 years, since World War II, their use has become commonplace. They've made our farming efficient, profitable. They clear our yards, our forests, our homes of unwanted pests. We use them in our kitchens. We rub them on our skin. They coat our shelf paper. We sleep under moth-proof blankets impregnated with deodorant. Hang strips saturated with lindane in our closets. We coat our lawns, our gardens with lethal sprays and dusts. And every meal we eat carries its load of chlorinated hydrocarbons, DDT, other related chemicals. We'd all been made so well aware of the benefits of these pest controls. But why had no one alerted us to their potential dangers? The question I asked is so simple. Is it possible to lay down this barrage of poison on the surface of the earth without making the earth unfit for all life? I decided to write the book. It was May of 1958. I signed a contract with Houghton Mifflin. It would be a short book. It would be written and edited, published by the end of that year. 7 months is all I would give it. Wishful thinking. 2.5 years later, I was still researching. I hadn't even started to write. The book just kept growing. There were mountains of material, and new data appeared almost daily. The facts all had to be checked and rechecked, and the clues had to be tracked down. The job was far larger than anything I had imagined, and far more complex. I was dealing with the most recent research in both biology and chemistry, and without enormous help from scientists, physicians, field experts from all across the world, it would have been impossible. I was pulling together all of these widely scattered facts that had... It's important. I was pulling together all of these widely scattered facts that had never previously been considered in relationship to one another. The ramifications were enormous. The evidence against the use of the chemicals was damning. Meanwhile, my personal life was in havoc. My mother died the first year. That shook me to my core. Roger was a very lonely little boy. My focus was on the book. I developed an ulcer, started having heart problems, got arthritis in my hand so badly I couldn't write, a whole catalogue of illnesses. But I was able to keep working because the material was fascinating. It was as if I were putting together the pieces of an enormous jigsaw puzzle. Then in 1961, I found out about the cancer. And I had to begin treatment at once. The radiation exhausted me. And I couldn't keep up with the work. I was horribly discouraged. I wanted to give it all up. I had no idea where the end lay. But the treatments ended, my energy returned, found my way back. It was like one of those bad dreams where one tries to run, can't. Drive a car, it won't go. I was only able to write a few hours a day, and I was baffled by the mounting obstacles to what I was so determined to accomplish. Finally, when the end came and decided I was exhilarated, it was as if I were riding the crest of a wave of enthusiasm and creativity. Once again, I could write late into the night, start up again at dawn, and nothing was going to stop me. Nothing did. Last year, after After 4.5 years, I finished. Joseph McCarthy. I'll never forget the night Mr. Shawn telephoned me. William Shawn is the editor of the New Yorker magazine. He had decided that he wanted to publish large sections of the book in serial form. He had just read my manuscript, and he telephoned me saying everything I could have asked or hoped for. That night, after Roger was asleep, I came back in here. I put on the Beethoven Violin Concerto. It's one of my favorites. And suddenly the tension of the 4 years was broken. And I let the tears come. That night, the thoughts of all the birds and the other creatures, all the loveliness that is in nature, came to me with such a surge of deep happiness. I had done what I could. I'd been able to complete it. And now it had its own life. I have to write this speech. I want it done before Roger gets home. The rest of my week is so busy. I'm going all the way to California to deliver it, if I ever get it written.
We're very fortunate to have 3 wonderful panelists to talk about Rachel Carson's work and the challenges we face in the 21st century that Rachel Carson addressed in the mid-20th century. We have Dr. Deborah Rice, who works for the Centers for Disease Control in Maine. She is an expert at the impacts of certain chemicals on human development. She was very helpful in Maine in helping the legislature understand some of those threats and risks to health and helping us pass legislation to protect Maine citizens from certain chemicals, particularly fire retardants, but there are others.
What I'm going to try to do in a few minutes is just give an overview of where we've come in the last 50 years since Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, where we are with the science. I'm going to say a little bit about regulation and finally where I think we need to go from here. And hopefully that will be a segue into some of the more specific things that the other 2 folks are going to talk about. Oh, I have to say that I'm speaking tonight as a private citizen. I do, in fact, work for the CDC, but I am not speaking as an employee of the CDC, and the views that I'm going to present are not necessarily those of the Maine Center for Environmental Protection. So, how are we doing in protecting public health and the environment? Well, of course, it's a good news, bad news thing. We understand a lot more now about the pathways that regulate biological processes than we did 50 years ago. You heard Rachel Carson talking about death, talking about insects dying and birds dying. We understand now that there are a lot more subtle effects that go on that don't necessarily result in overt death, but are nonetheless very important. And we know much more about how chemicals affect these pathways. We also understand a lot more about how chemicals act in the environment. You heard the story about you put a chemical down and it affects animals or insects kind of 4 levels away. That was really kind of new thinking. And we understand a lot more about that now. But regulation has lagged in response to this understanding, which is probably no surprise to any of you in the room tonight. 50 years ago, we were really only concerned about the effects of environmental chemicals on death, which you heard about in the film, cancer, and overt toxicity, in other words, overt poisoning. I've been a toxicologist for decades, and I used to joke when I was a student that the only thing toxicologists cared about was cancer in middle-aged men. And that might have been a bit of an overstatement, but there was really a lot of truth to that. We really didn't understand the mechanisms of toxicity. We had no concept of subtle effects. If there weren't bodies in the street, then everything was just fine. Many effects were thought to be reversible that in fact left permanent impairment. And I think the poster child for that is that it was thought that if a child got lead poisoning and had seizures and was in the hospital but managed to survive, that there weren't any permanent consequences to that. And that is far from the truth. These children carry the consequences of that poisoning for a lifetime, and not only that, but much lower exposures to lead also have lifetime consequences, even though the child wasn't lead poisoned. Our basic understanding of biology is much more sophisticated now than it was 50 years ago. I mean, there's just no question about that. We understand the chemical pathways of normal function, and that allows us then to understand the potential for environmental chemicals to interact with these pathways and these functions at various points. And this is just a schematic. I'm not going to test you on this. This is just an example of points where chemicals can affect the thyroid system. And we all have heard about endocrine disruptors and how important those are and how significant they are in terms of environmental and human health. We usually talk about reproductive hormones, estrogen, estrogenic compounds or androgenic compounds, but of course the thyroid hormone is part of the endocrine system. So this is just all the parts of this pathway because it's regulated very tightly. Your body tries to keep its hormone levels within a very tight band, and it does that by various feedback loops and so forth. And this is just some of the chemicals that can affect the thyroid pathway, and you see these are flame retardants, dioxins, PCBs, more flame retardants here and here, some pesticides, perchlorate, which you may have heard about. So you can see that these are just a few chemicals, and they can affect the pathways, these pathways, in many places, and there's increasing understanding of the truth of that. We also know that many organ systems may be affected, many more than we were focusing on 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. Recent focus has been on the potential effects on numerous parts of the endocrine system as well as immune function. So this is just a schematic of the body with various endocrine glands. We've talked about the thyroid gland, and here is the reproductive glands. But the endocrine system also regulates fat, lipid metabolism, regulates carbohydrate metabolism, kidney function, bone structure, calcium regulation, which we've all heard about in relation to overall health. And chemicals can affect all of these systems in a multitude of ways. I'm sure that many of you may have heard about obesogens lately, for example, the ability of these chemicals to actually interfere with lipid metabolism and lipid regulation and predispose individuals towards obesity. We also appreciate that life stage is an important determinant of toxicity. We really do understand now that the fetus and infant may be particularly vulnerable because these systems are still developing. The fetal brain is, the brain of a child is developing until the age of 21, which is why teenagers don't act like adults. Their brains really aren't mature yet. Early exposure may produce effects decades later, and this is something that we've really come to understand only in the last 10 years or so. For example, low birth weight predisposes towards later obesity. And there's increasing evidence, certainly from the experimental animal literature, as well as we're now starting to get glimpses of that in epidemiological human studies, that these very early exposures can have effects on heart disease and effects on other systems literally decades later, which is really pretty scary. Individuals with certain diseases may also be at increased risk. Now, old age isn't a disease, but as we age, we tend to get diseases. Not only that, but our reserve capacity decreases. Our immune system isn't quite as good. Our kidney function isn't quite as good, so that exposure to environmental chemicals may produce effects as we age that may not have been produced earlier in life because we had a reserve capacity, so we weren't seeing the fact that these chemicals may in fact have been affecting us. Thousands of chemicals, no screening. So this is still 50 years later, this is still the situation. The number of chemicals in commerce now exceeds 84,000. You heard that Rachel Carson was talking about pesticides and very, very high dose application of pesticides. Well, now we have many, many other wonderful chemicals that aren't pesticides. A recent EPA publication stated there are thousands of chemicals yet to be screened and assessed. And EPA proposes to start looking at fewer than 83 beginning this year. So that's the situation, still the situation 50 years later. I think that's something that folks don't understand, and this was alluded to in the film as well, that we assume that somebody up there is taking care of us in terms of our exposure to chemicals and their safety. Industry, for the most part, can put any chemical it wants into products and into commerce and into the environment. The only chemicals that are required to undergo screening are pesticides. Only pesticides. And that may, in fact, be the legacy of Rachel Carson. But nothing else is required to undergo screening. And I do mean screening. The pesticides only undergo the crudest of tests, really, compared to our understanding of, our modern understanding of biology. We only examine a few systems. We can only pick up exposure at high doses, and then there's argument from industry that, oh, those are high doses, and so low doses aren't going to have any effect at all. Some important organ systems are not examined. The immune system isn't looked at all. Most of the endocrine system isn't looked at all. Cardiovascular system isn't looked at all unless there are actual physical heart defects that you can see doing the pathology, including increased blood pressure. We know now that many of these chemicals increase blood pressure, which, you know, is an important clinical manifestation for public health. There is also no requirement to estimate persistence in the environment or accumulation up the food chain. And as you heard in the film, the importance of this was known, at least by Rachel Carson, 50 years ago. Some chemicals can remain in the environment for decades, such as PCBs and older pesticides. Concentration up the food chain can and does put predators at risk. This has been documented in raptors and other birds and marine mammals. And don't forget that we are at the top of the food chain. It's important for us to understand. And some of the effects that have been documented, you know, in addition to these high-dose exposures that just kills everything, reproductive failure, inability to catch prey, abnormal behaviors, and motor weakness. And what you find is that some of these birds just leave their nests, for example, or they're too weak or too uncoordinated to catch their prey, and so they die, or their offspring die. So is the environment cleaner than it was 50 years ago? Maybe. The Clean Air and Clean Water Acts have certainly been responsible for a much cleaner environment in many ways. Our rivers have been substantially cleaned up. Air pollution is much lower than it was in the 60s. I lived in California then, and you know, this is where I lived, this is what it looked like. And you know, it's no longer the case anymore. Some legacy pollutants have decreased, such as DDT and PCBs and lead. And these are chemicals that came under very strict scrutiny because of episodes of massive poisoning or massive die-offs, which has resulted in some public health successes. For example, lead was removed from gasoline in the 70s. It was also removed from solder in cans and plumbing. We used to get high doses of lead from our cans, from our canned food. So blood lead levels have decreased dramatically, and by that I mean orders of magnitude. It's a real, in many ways, a public health success. However, all of our levels are still above historical background before we started mining lead, and there is no apparent threshold for neurotoxicity in children. So the studies that are coming out now are still documenting neurotoxicity as a function of lead exposure, even though lead levels have decreased dramatically. Similarly, PCBs and DDT were banned in the 70s, and so consequently body burdens have decreased dramatically. But we still have body burdens of PCBs and DDT metabolites in our bodies, all of us do, and so does wildlife and the animals that we eat. And buying organic is no help there, because it's not necessarily in the food that's fed to the animals, it's in the environment, it comes down with the rain, it just is everywhere in the atmosphere. There are many more chemicals now in commerce than there were 50 years ago, with no information on toxicity, persistence, or bioaccumulation, because there's absolutely no law that requires these data to be collected. 50 years later, there's no law that requires these data to be collected. And I'm sure many of you have heard of some of these, you know, the flame retardants, and I think you're going to hear more about them later. Bisphenol A and phthalates, and these are chemicals that are in the products that you bring into your home. They're in your personal care products, they're in your cosmetics, they're in your textiles, they're in your furniture. So you're bringing these chemicals into your home and exposing yourselves and your families to them. So my bottom line is that regulatory agencies need to do a much better job, which I'm sure is not a surprise given everything I've just said. I think that we should require screening of all chemicals by industry before they're put into the environment, not after. Because the situation is now that a chemical gets put into the environment, and it's up to academia or the government to then try to see whether it's toxic or not. Well, clearly, nobody's going to do that for 84,000 chemicals. It's impossible. So the burden should be on industry to test these chemicals before they're put out. We also need to ensure that information on the constituents of products is available to the public. When you bring these products into your home, unless, you know, Consumer Reports or an academic institution or somebody else has gone out and bought these products and tested them to see what's in them, you have no way in the world of knowing what you're bringing into your home. We need to develop high throughput assays to test the thousands of chemicals that need testing. And by that, I mean very rapid screening tests that are not done on the whole animal, but are done on, say, specific genes, an array of specific genes. This is underway by the federal government. In fact, EPA has a multi-million-dollar program that is doing exactly that. And what they're doing is they're identifying the pathways that lead to a specific toxic effect. And scientifically, this is a wonderful idea. It's very doable, because then you can submit various portions or various parts of this pathway where you've developed assays, and you can just dump, you know, 1,000 chemicals into that particular assay and see whether it's affected or not. But I can guarantee that this is going to meet substantial industry resistance. In fact, I gave a talk on this specific to neurotoxicity, because I'm by training a developmental neurotoxicologist, in a symposium 2 or 3 years ago. Talking about the EPA program and what I considered to be the pluses and minuses and where we might get into some problem with it. And you know, one of the points I made was that I thought that there was going to be considerable pushback by industry because of the issue of they're going to say that just because it affects the pathway does not mean that that's going to lead to an adverse effect. In fact, they do it now for whole animal systems. You'll see an effect on the whole animal, and they'll say, well, yes, but prove that that's really an adverse effect. And when I finished my talk, and when the folks at EPA finished getting up and talking about the program, my colleague from Monsanto, whom I've known for many years, jumped up and said, you can't do this because you're not going to be able to demonstrate that it is an adverse effect. So my prediction is that EPA is going to spend millions of dollars, and they're going to do a very nice job scientifically of developing these throughput assays, and then they're going to fight with industry for the next 20 years to get this so that it means anything. So on that pessimistic note, I will leave you with that. So thank you very much.
Amanda Sears, who's with the Environmental Health Strategy Center, their whole nonprofit is about trying to understand the impacts of chemicals on human population and protecting humans from products that get on the market.
Let me first, though, talk a little bit about the Toxic Substance Control Act. Because that is the law that is meant to protect us. That's the law that was developed, it was passed in 1976, and it was intended to provide a framework for federal regulation of chemicals that present an unreasonable risk of injury. The problem is that this law was never has been useful. It's broken from the beginning, and it hasn't been effective at protecting either health or the environment. Which is what it was intended to do. In fact, it's often described by Sharon Tischer, who's a law professor up at the University of Maine. She says that within environmental law, it's described as perhaps the most complex, confusing, and ineffective of all of our federal environmental protection statutes. It's also among the only environmental statutes federally that has never been reauthorized. And so Dr. Rice talked a lot about, over the past 50 years, how much more we've learned and how much better science has got about understanding these things. Our law that was really broken to begin with, then over the past 35 years, has not been updated. And so it has not been modernized to reflect any of that advanced understanding that we've developed over the past 50 years. So there's sort of many problems with it. With the exception of PCBs, since TSCA was enacted, the EPA has not used it to effectively regulate and review the risk of chemicals in commerce. The EPA has reviewed the risk of about 2% of the chemicals that were grandfathered in, the 62,000 chemicals that were grandfathered in under the law 35 years ago. So just 2% of those chemicals have the EPA been able to review the risks of. There's really a catch-22 with the law, with the Toxic Substance Control Act, which is called TSCA, by the way. So if I refer to TSCA, that's what I mean. And the catch-22 is that the EPA has to already have data in order to require testing. And so they need to, in order to issue testing orders to manufacturers, they can only do that after the EPA has met the significant burden of finding substantial evidence that a chemical may present unreasonable risk. And so in order to gain information about risk, they have to already know information about risk. So really the EPA's hands are tied often about being able to do anything about chemicals. And then with new chemicals entering the market, the TSCA does require that manufacturers submit pre-market notifications of new chemicals, but then they don't require that that actually has any information about toxicity. And so less than 20% of those pre-market notifications end up having information about toxicity within them. They basically, the catch-22 that I mentioned earlier, it means that companies don't want to submit information because they don't want to give the EPA information that then they can use to get more information. And so it's, that catch-22 promulgates with new chemicals as well. So what has TSCA done since 1976? The EPA has only taken regulatory action restricting use of 5 chemicals or classes of chemicals. Those are PCBs, CFCs, which are chlorinated fluorocarbons, dioxins, asbestos, and hexavalent chromium. And the EPA's regulation of asbestos, which was promulgated only after the EPA had spent 10 years gathering evidence, was overturned by the federal courts because the EPA failed to meet the high burden of proof under TSCA that was needed. And that was with asbestos. So you can see that sort of gives an indication of how difficult it is to regulate a chemical under TSCA. So TSCA is broken. The federal law that's meant to protect us is broken. Right now we have the first real opportunity that we've had since then to pass meaningful federal chemical reform, and that's what's called the Safe Chemicals Act. It's currently before the Senate, and within the next month we're anticipating that the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee will vote on that law, and then that it will go to the full Senate this summer. And so it's really the first opportunity we've had where Congress is voting on whether or not to update and to fix and modernize the Toxic Substance Control Act. So it's a really great opportunity, and I'll talk a little bit more about it after Bob talks about what Maine's done to fill in some of the gaps since we haven't had effective federal regulation.
Maine has been a leader on environmental policy around toxics in the environment, and Representative Bob Duchesne, who's another panelist, serves in the legislature and was there during the efforts to pass a number of these bills. So he's a real veteran of getting environmental bills passed.
Yeah, I can give you a little bit of the political angle of this whole thing. And it's fun to do forums like this because after 8 years I get to look back and figure out what was it I just did. And it also makes me think of the broader picture, so I'll try to give you some of that from a political context. And I guess I'll start with why is this such a hard battle? 50 years later we've made so little progress. We're still not testing chemicals. Why is that? You would think by now we would have gotten smarter. I mean, any typical animal, if it starts to think it's being poisoned by what it's eating, it'll stop eating. We're about the only species that will say, you know I'm poisoning myself, but someday I should stop. I don't know how we get to the top of the food chain. But every chemical has a constituency. most likely it's cheap to produce, and it's very useful. Brominated flame retardants, I think it's primarily made out of bromine from salts that found on salt flats. It's an easy chemical to come up with and to convert into a useful product. And so it's cheap and easy, and it's going to be hard for a company that's making a profit off it to let go of it. Any state that makes that chemical or uses it in a major manufacturing process is not going to take the lead on banning something. It's too much part of its own industry. When Washington State phased out brominated flame retardants, it exempted Boeing. Because Boeing makes airplanes there in Washington State. So a lot of those uses were put off limits. And we're just as bad. Bath Iron Works uses it in their warships, and we exempted a lot of those applications too. So you've always got that special interest constituency going on, and all politics are local. It is really hard to regulate bisphenol A when it's in the caps of Kevin Ray's mustard jars. So it gets tricky even at a local level. Even when there are safer substitutes that may be available, they don't actually have a constituency yet. They don't have a fan club. They don't have companies ready to mass produce this in major quantities and sell it to people as a safe substitute. So you don't have a champion of the new chemical, a safer substitute, that you have for the old one. It's really hard to make that switch politically. And of course, money in politics is a big part of the issue. As was mentioned by Rachel Carson, I think, and certainly in other parts of the forum, DuPont and the petrochemical companies had a lot of money to buy the influence they needed to prevent progress. That's still happening. It's, with Citizens United, it's probably even worse. Don't you think it's weird that we spend more time looking for a cure for cancer and more resources than actually figuring out what's giving us the cancer? That's primarily why. A lot of people don't want to know the answer to that. They'd rather cure it than prevent it. Now, certain states are more likely to be progressive on chemical policy. There's probably about 16 out of our 50 states that tend to be a little more progressive. And I was trying to figure out what is it the key to these states that makes them different. First of all, chemicals aren't a significant part of their economy. I don't think you'll see Delaware, where a lot of chemicals are made, getting too far advanced, and certainly not Louisiana. So if chemicals are a big part of your economy, you're not going to be one of the leading states. There's a cultural ethic in some states that's missing in others. In some states, not even conservatives are willing to be poisoned for business. Some states don't mind so much. I hate to pick on Louisiana, but when I visited there, littering is a culture. I watched people throw their McDonald's bags out the car window. It's just a different culture than some other states. Primarily, most of the states who are active on this are northern. 8 out of the 16 share a border with Canada. And 2 others are closer. Massachusetts and Oregon are also part of that 16. The only southernmost states that are really doing anything at all are Maryland and West Virginia. None of the Old South is really taking any lead at all on this. So you can see a cultural divide a little bit on this. And I guess lastly, the ones who tend to be a little more active are downwind. So you see Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, all more active than a lot of the western states, certainly the southwestern states, because this is the way the bad air is coming. You know, we get animated about mercury because Indiana is burning coal and sending it to us. So that's part of what we have to deal with. I call this next section the Empire Strikes Back. We've been fighting, I think, on a state-by-state basis because the federal government has failed completely. What happened with Tosca is really a travesty. It's been clear for a long time to a lot of states who don't want their kids poisoned that this has to be fought at the state level. And there's a benefit to that because when states do their own patchwork approaches, it drives the industry nuts. And even they will start pushing for action at the federal level rather than be regulated on a piecemeal basis. So we don't even try to be like other states. The more we're different, the more it annoys the industry, and maybe they'll do something about it. But they have now found ways to fight back. And the original way the chemical industries fight back is the same way the tobacco industry used to fight back. They deny and stonewall, I think is my shorthand for it. Chemical industries just took right out of the playbook of tobacco. They use shell scientific organizations to produce bad science and then proclaim that as good science. They're willing to lie as far as I'm concerned. In my 8 years in the legislature, I saw more things said in that committee room that appeared to me to be lies by the chemical industry than anybody else, by far. And I'm not shy about saying that. If you read the record, we phased out brominated flame retardants piecemeal. Some of the obvious ones that were worse than others. There's a number of different ways you can arrange the molecules, but penta and octa brominated flame retardants became pretty clearly bad a few years ago, and we started to phase those out. If you go back and read the record, the chemical industries were testifying, no, these are safe, these have not been proven harmful. A few years later, after we banned them anyway, they will even admit out loud, yeah, I guess maybe they were. And we don't make those anymore. It was probably a good thing we moved on to DECA, which has got 10. So DECA brominated flame retardants became the next battleground. It turns out, as research was starting to show, that breaks down into the stuff we just banned. And they would provide testimony saying, no, it's not breaking down. It's really not leaching out of the product. It's really not dangerous. And we'd show them, and Dr. Rice would have the evidence. And the advocates would have actual physical evidence on good scientific testing. And they would bring in their faux scientists and say, well, you just didn't do the test right, or it doesn't reach the conclusion that you should have. I used the wrong mouse was my favorite one. That was, oh boy. Yeah, used the wrong mouse. No wonder your technique is bad. And they would even do the appeal thing. They brought in a burn victim, a gentleman to testify. He was badly burned, and he was their lead witness really to testify, we really need flame retardants, and these help save lives and prevent injuries. Well, when I questioned him, it turns out he was burned as an infant when an electrical cord caught his blanket on fire. DECA brominated flame retardant wouldn't have helped him at all. He was burned by something completely unrelated. He was only there to play in our sympathies. And that's the level I found these guys stooping to. And they do it state by state. It's a road show. Because this is done state by state, so they take the show on the road, and that's what they do. Well, denying Stonewall, I think, works at the federal level because it's been working for so long. Not working so good at the state level because we've started banning stuff. And it's been driving them a little crazy, and I think it's probably forcing them to shift their tactics. We've seen, I think, a shift in just the last 4 to 6 years. You start to see more activity from shadow groups like ALEC, which you may have heard of. Yeah, the American Legislative Exchange Council. They produce model legislation on a state-by-state basis, which is an attempt really to do the same thing that states are doing. If you can do something regressive in the state, maybe you can do it regressive in the state. So they're producing that and having their friends introduce it in the legislature and changing the tone of the conversation a little bit. From rather than advancing good protections, they're actually trying to roll them back on a state-by-state basis. And when you have a culture change or a political change like we just had, that gains a certain amount of traction within a state, even like Maine, which has been very progressive. I think another major shift you're seeing is that industry now cooperates more, sort of. They cooperate with attempts at regulation in an effort to get the weakest regulation possible, especially at the federal level. So yeah, they'll come to the table, they'll help. They'll even provide a little bit of money, providing you come to the conclusion they want. And then they try to get the states to conform to whatever the federal standard may happen to be. So if it's a much lower standard, they would like the federal legislation to preempt what other states have done on a more progressive basis. So that shift in tactics, I think, is relatively new. They'll actually work to get minimum content thresholds. So yes, we know this poison is in our product, but it's, so long as you don't get over a threshold of this amount of poison, it should be exempt. Well, poison is poison, and it really isn't a solution, but it's the kind of thing they will now propose, whereas before they were just denying Stonewall, now they're trying to minimize and prolong the danger as long as possible, and it's pretty overt. That kind of leads to a code speak, too. Watch how this develops. Instead of rolling back protections, which is really what the emphasis has been in the state for the last 2 years, we now speak in terms of conforming to federal standards. Well, federal standards are a floor. They always were intended to be a floor. States that are downwind may need a little more protection than states who are upwind and not releasing so much mercury. So, or various other products that we're breathing out of smokestacks. So some states need to be more protective. When you're rolling back to federal standards, you're really going to the floor level, even when your problem is greater than other states. And so that kind of code speak has taken over just a little bit in recent years. To some extent, we're also trapped a little bit by our own code. You can really only pass what you have the votes to pass. So it's really more easy to pass something when you're involving children, because we all care about kids, even conservatives, especially your own kids. So we do the Kid Safe Product Act. And that's all well and good, but we also poison adults too. You know, cosmetics, there's a lot of bad stuff in cosmetics that we don't regulate and really have not even gotten close to, because those are adults, they're less vulnerable. This is stuff you put in your lips. If it gets into your system, don't be too surprised. But we have really almost gotten into a trap a little bit about being very protective of kids and not being quite as able to recognize what we're also doing to adults, because you're seeing a lot of effects among adults as well. There's also a problem with whack-a-mole, is what we call it. We ban something in a product, and so the chemical industry finds a new market for it. And we thought we had done this pretty much with decabrominated flame retardants. We banned most of the uses that were existing in Maine, and all of a sudden, they're putting it in food pellets. All pallets, when they are doing marketing, when they're shipping products, are on wood pellets. Well, now they're making them out of plastic, and they're putting in computer chips so they can track them. But because of fire codes, you know, these are basically made out of petroleum. You know, most of our world is made out of petroleum these days, so you need a lot of flame retardant in order to stack these in a warehouse. It turns out they were using a lot of flame retardant, and we thought we banned it in the state, and all of a sudden there was a new input coming in, and we had to go back at it again. Because this stuff is cheap and easy to make, there's always a market for it, and you got to stay on top of it all the time and keep your policy going forward. I think I'll leave you with this too. Whenever you're having one of these fights, the question is really who pays? Because you get different constituency groups depending on what their impact is with that. So for instance, we could solve a lot of these problems just by putting labels on products so that adults would have an idea what's being sold to them. Except the retail branches, retail outlets, hate labeling. First of all, it interferes with their marketing because you don't want to say bad things on a label that's supposed to make you buy the product. And second of all, if there's labels on the shelves, that takes up shelf space. So that really causes the retailers a lot of heartburn. The Chamber of Commerce wants to protect its industries that use these products, for instance. So if you use some uncertain chemicals in the state, the Chamber of Commerce is automatically going to be on your side because you are a business. They are very slow to come to the table and find solutions like that. And then, of course, the manufacturer doesn't want to incur the cost of going to a safer product. They've already got all their manufacturing processes in line. They've made the investment, they've sunk the capital costs. It's expensive to change to a safer product, even if you know you're poisoning people. So depending on what the regulation is, you've always got at least one of those three constituencies against you. If you come up with a law that's pretty darn progressive, you've got all three against you. And it's really hard to pass.
The thing is, yes, it's overwhelming. And at the same time, as somebody who thinks about this issue every single day, I just want to tell you that I have never felt more momentum for changing all of those problems than there is right now. And so we are at a point where we can actually make a difference on this issue. I feel like what happened was Rachel Carson published Silent Spring 50 years ago, and there was a flurry of activity. You know, we made some real progress at that time with banning DDT, with setting up the EPA. You know, there was a flurry of action that happened right after Silent Spring. And then there's what I feel happened, you know, there was like a couple of decades on this issue where there wasn't as much momentum, where we lost some of that. And right now we're at a point where we're able to, I think, seize that momentum back up again and fix the problem that Rachel Carson, you know, told us all about 50 years ago. And so I want to tell you about a few things that you can do to help us seize that momentum. Something going on at the federal level, some things going on at the state level, and some things you can do as consumers. So bear with me and then ask lots of questions. So at the federal level, as I mentioned earlier, federal law is broken. There's a good law that's been introduced. That law is called the Safe Chemicals Act. It was introduced by Senator Frank Lautenberg from New Jersey. It has a lot of co-sponsors, and it is going to be heard, well, it's already had a hearing in committee, and that committee will be voting on it later this month. And then the Senate will be voting on it later this summer. So the bill would fix a lot of the problems that Dr. Rice, in her last slide, she talks about some of the things we need to do, and it would do a lot of those things. It would make sure that the chemical industry for the first time would have to develop and provide information on the health and environmental safety of chemicals. It would take immediate action on the worst chemicals. It would rely upon the best science. In 2008, the National Academy of Sciences made a detailed recommendation for how EPA could improve the way it assesses the risk of chemicals, and the Safe Chemicals Act would require that the EPA actually it would require them and give them the authority to actually put that into practice. And so the Safe Chemicals Act is a great opportunity, and it's something that we can pass. It's never had more momentum than it has now, reform of federal policies. So what can you do? One, if you have a little bit of time on your hands and want a great trip to DC, is you can you can join our bus trip happening. We're going to be having a bus of people from Maine go down to join a National Lobby Day. The National Lobby Day is on May 22nd. The bus will be leaving from, I think, Portland on May 21st, and it will be drive down for the day on the bus. We're going to have movies. It'll be fun. And then spend the day on the 22nd on the Hill lobbying for the Safe Chemicals Act with a whole bunch of folks from around the country, and to really seize the momentum that will have come from the vote happening in the committee, and then come back on the 23rd. So that's one specific opportunity. If you can't go that day, you could write a letter to the editor about the Safe Chemicals Act. If you're interested in doing that, please get in touch with my organization, the Environmental Health Strategy Center, and I can, my website is preventharm.org. So if you want to get in touch with us, that's how. You could also look us up on Facebook, and we'll give you samples for letters to the editor or an opinion editorial. There's lots of things you can do. You can also, of course, call your senators and ask them to vote in support of the Safe Chemicals Act. Both senators from Maine have said that they agree that the Toxic Substance Control Act, TSCA, is broken, and they think we need to fix it, and this is the time to fix it. So that's huge. That's they said that in November in reaction to the Maine Coalition, the Alliance for a Clean and Healthy Maine, has been doing work to get them to that point for several years. And finally, after a large petition drive focused on the senators, they've said, yes, the current law is broken, it needs to be fixed. Now we need them to say, and this is the way to fix it. And that's what we're at the verge of right now. So a call to the senators saying, take this opportunity, let's fix it now, would be great. At the state level, as Representative Duchesne said, Maine has been such a leader. We have done great work in the state. And just maybe I'll tell a little personal anecdote about one of the reasons I feel optimistic. I have a 4.5-year-old daughter, and when I was pregnant with her, I registered, for my baby shower, and I was registering for baby bottles. And I could not, at the time, I was one of, probably 5 people in the state of Maine who knew about BPA. I could not find BPA-free baby bottles for sale in the state of Maine. I had to register for them online at, some far-off retailer. So 4.5 short years ago, you could not find a BPA-free baby bottle in the state of Maine. Since then, we have passed laws so that you cannot now find a BPA-containing baby bottle in the state of Maine. And that's just since my 4.5-year-old daughter has been born. So we can make a difference, and we can shift huge markets. These are markets, these are, Gerber, all these, major companies that were making baby bottles with BPA for decades. And just when parents started figuring out, oh, this chemical is in it, and it doesn't have to be, and we should change policy, the entire market shifted over the course of a couple of years. So we can do this. And so BPA in particular is something that now it's not in baby bottles. However, it's still in our canned foods. And so every time you open up, pull your can opener out and open up a can of foods, you are getting exposed to BPA. And if whether or not you know about BPA, you've probably heard of it, because last year it was a big firestorm when our governor, when we were trying to get it out of baby bottles, said that the worst it could do is cause little beards, which was incorrect. But that's probably, if you're thinking, where have I heard of BPA before? That's probably it. And so BPA is an endocrine disruptor, as Dr. Rice was saying when she had the picture of the body with all the different pieces of the endocrine system that can be affected. It's one of those chemicals that can affect the endocrine system. So we've collected signatures from across the state to petition the Board of Environmental Protection to get BPA out of food packaging intended for use by or intentionally marketed to children under 3. The reason that we could only do for children under 3 right now is because of our Kid Safe Products Act. It was an exemption that was put into that act. You sort of alluded to it, that Ray Mustard, which is from our Senate President, Kevin Ray. It's also, BPA is used in the lids of jars, and so it was a sort of a special exemption that he managed to get into that law to get so that the only food packaging that could be regulated under the Kid Safe Products Act is food intentionally marketed to children under 3. So this year, we're going to the BP, the Board of Environmental Protection, to say, let's get it out of packaging intentionally marketed to kids under 3. And next year, we'll be going to the Maine legislature to say, let's get rid of that exemption and get it out of food for all of us. So those are two things that are coming right up in Maine. What you can do is you can sign a petition. I actually have some here. For candidates for the legislature, because we're going to be talking to them over the next several months to make sure that this is something they're thinking about as their candidates, so that when they're elected, they'll be primed and ready. Another thing is, as a parent of 2 toddlers, a lot of people hand their toddlers the receipts because kids like to grab them from the people at the counter, and then they like to play with them, they like to chew on them. So again, try to keep the receipts away from the kids because the receipt paper has BPA in it. Thermal receipt paper, so not all receipts, but a lot of receipts do. So those are 2 BPA ideas for protecting yourself. Around another set of chemicals that I can give you a couple of specific examples on is perfluorinated chemicals. These are Gore-Tex, Scotchgard, and Teflon. So when you're replacing your pans in your kitchen, look for pans that are stainless steel or cast iron or glass, the pots, and avoid those that have Teflon coating, because the Teflon coating is made out of perfluorinated compounds that are, again, are endocrine disruptors and are things you want to avoid. And then another example is if you're buying new furniture, oftentimes they'll ask you if you want it to be Scotch guarded, and so I would just suggest that you don't do that. You don't have them Scotch guard it. Representative Dana Dow, who's a Maine state legislator, he owns a furniture company, and he was part of a study we did a few years ago where we tested the blood of 13 Mainers, and he tested the highest for these perfluorinated compounds. And he said, I'm sure the reason is because I own a furniture store and we spray it on. And he said that they spray it in the store, so it's not something, they don't usually come Scotch guarded, it's something they add at the store. So you can ask for your products not to be Scotch guarded. And one other example is when I bought a used car for our family's car, and they, right before we left, they said, okay, well, pick it up later today because we're going to clean it out and we're going to Scotch guard the whole inside so all your kids' grubby stuff won't get all over the interior. And I said, whoa, hey, actually don't Scotch guard it, please. So just keep an eye out when people are offering to Scotch guard things for you. I would suggest that you don't do that because then you can reduce some exposure to those perfluorinated compounds.
We had lead in our paint long after Europe got rid of it.
Or Canada, or
Canada.
Australia.
I mean, we knew for years it was poisoning us, and we didn't get rid of it. Yeah. And Europe certainly has a very long history of poisoning itself, so perhaps they're a little more sensitive to the fact they were using lead pipes long after they should have. So I'm not surprised they got there before we did, but it's the political thing and the influence of money, I think, that keeps us from
It's the money. Yeah, it's the money. An assay is just, instead of using a whole animal, taking a bunch of animals and giving them a chemical and testing them and see what the effects are on the whole animal. An assay would be an organ system where you cut out a kidney and look at the kidney, or you grind up a bunch of cells, and then you put those in a petri dish or something like that, and you look at the effects. You put in the chemical and look at the effects on those cells. What they're able to do now is they're able to do what's called I mean, you can actually buy these things, and it will be like a big matrix of different genes in little holes. And then you can just basically pour your chemical on that, gene array and see whether the function of the gene goes up or goes down. And you can do it for proteins. You can do it for a whole variety of things. I mean, these are beginning now to be sort of off-the-shelf systems. So an assay is basically, I mean, it can be a whole animal assay, but usually when people use the word assay, it means something that's not the whole animal.
Or the Kid Safe Product Act. Right now it's banned primarily for products, kids, especially food products under 3 years old, where much of the time a chemical is really you're always looking for safer alternatives, but not all alternatives work in every product. So often you have to do it on a product-by-product basis in order to gradually phase out a chemical as safer products come online. So since we're always doing this on a product-by-product basis, new products pop up. That's what I call whack-a-mole. We never saw that one coming. Then we end up having the same fight all over again.
Yeah, there's kind of another aspect to whack-a-mole, I think, too, and that is that if we ban a particular chemical, industry just comes up with a chemical where the structure is just slightly tweaked. You know, it's essentially the same chemical with the same, you know, the same process, the same sort of actions in the environment and the same toxicity, but now it's a different chemical. And I know I was talking to congressional staffers, federal congressional staffers at one point, and I said, you know, they're like drug dealers. And I said, don't quote me on that. But it's really true, you know, because drug dealers do the same thing. If you make a chemical, if you make it a Schedule I chemical and you make it illegal, they just go into the lab and they make something slightly different, and then that's legal. And then they can sell that, and then, you know, then the legislators have to come in and make that product illegal. We tried to, what we were going to do at one point was to try to ban all brominated flame retardants. I mean, that was kind of like up next on the list, and then the administration changed, and so that would never happen. Because the class of brominated flame retardants that are banned in Maine now, only for specific purposes, are a very small fraction, a very small subset of brominated flame retardants, let alone flame retardants in general. So it's just, you know, the way in which this has to be done is very onerous and very discouraging sometimes.
Which is really,
sorry.
Well, that's really why we have to have a broad approach change at the federal level.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, we can't do it on a chemical by chemical basis. We really have to do something that's a little closer to that the principle, precautionary principle, right? You know, don't use them until they're proved safe, rather than testing these chemicals in ourselves.
Yeah, we're always chasing. We're always trying to close the barn door, you know, a week after the horses left.
Wood ash in the atmosphere is actually pretty harmful. There are limits to what you can do about it because you've got a heap of something. But that'll be on the radar again, I think, with the next decade.
For example, the rate of asthma in children is very high in Maine. And it's been postulated that may be one of the reasons is that so many people burn with wood. There's a huge push to not use animals, to use, you know, tissues. I mean, the tissues have to come from somewhere, but a lot of these tissues can be made pretty much immortal, so that, you know, you just keep separating them so they can pretty much last forever. And then I also talked about these, you know, these gene arrays or protein enzyme arrays, and I think that absolutely science is going in that direction. The government is going in that direction. It's used a lot in academia. So hopefully there'll be fewer and fewer animals that are actually used in research. And I think that really is the wave of the future. And I appreciate what you're saying. You know, that testing, and some of the historical testing on animals has been appalling. Like putting chemicals in rabbits' eyes to see whether they produce damage, for example, which is incredibly cruel. To answer your first question, you know, that's the role of chemicals in autism. You know, that's something that there's a lot of research going on now. There are hints. I mean, first of all, autism is largely a prenatal event, not a postnatal event. And it's very genetically, there's a huge genetic determinant of autism. On the other hand, it's probably, the etiology is probably multiple. You know, we call it autism, there's probably 100 things that go into whatever autism is, because it's really not a disease, it's a collection of symptoms. And there are hints that there are chemicals in the environment that are associated with an increased incidence of autism. In fact, there was a paper that just came out this week associating PCBs with autism. Now, the levels of PCBs have gone down dramatically, whereas the incidence of autism has gone up dramatically. So it's probably not PCBs, but there are many, many other thousands of chemicals out in the environment that probably act very much like PCBs that we know nothing about. You know, we know a lot about the behavioral effects of PCBs because there have been many, many multiple multi-million-dollar studies done in humans on PCBs. You know, and lead and methylmercury and a couple of pesticides. I mean, I don't know how much money has been spent on just looking at these chemicals. So we know a lot about them, but there are thousands of other chemicals out there that may, in fact, be contributing to the increased incidence of autism, and we don't know anything about it because, you know, how many millions of dollars can you spend? So that's kind of where we are in our knowledge, and it's very frustrating.
And I just wanted to add to that one little thing, which is that if you, I don't know if you have a pen, but if you jot down, just yesterday, Dr. Philip Landrigan, who I think is with Mount Sinai.
He is with Mount Sinai.
He just released a news release and or a study yesterday. I'm not exactly sure if it was a study or sort of an assemblage of studies.
It's a paper.
It's a paper, okay. That was about 10 different classes of chemicals that have a relationship to autism. So if you Google that, Google Philip Landrigan and autism, and you'll probably come up with that because it just came out yesterday.
Yeah, but again, that list, and I'm not disagreeing with you, and I think that I think the paper's an important paper, but I think it's important to say that it's looking for the keys under the lamppost, because these are chemicals that we know something about. And so he's got this list of, the 10 that are most associated with autism, or however he phrased it, I can't remember. But that's 10. Right. And then there's thousands of others that nobody's ever looked at.
Right.
Yeah, there's 84,000 others, minus 10.
Right.
So. Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think that paper's an important paper. I think that it focuses attention on it. It keeps it in the public spotlight, and I think that's an important thing to do. But it's not the last word.
No,
it's not going to be the last word.
Yeah.
What we heard in that film was really, they were going out at that time and they were putting really, really high doses of just pouring high doses of pesticides everywhere, and people only noticed because there were massive die-offs of whole species disappearing from wherever it was they just, poured this poison. And there's no question that that was real. And if we did that today, the exact same thing would happen. The distinction that I was trying to make was that now we're putting, different pesticides that we think aren't as harmful, or different kinds of chemicals, that may not be pesticides. And it's not causing massive die-offs anymore, although the honeybees, maybe it is. But what we are doing is we're influencing the environment, including ourselves, in much more subtle ways, so it becomes much more difficult to know that the chemicals that we're putting out there is producing effects, because we're not seeing, bodies in the street or bodies in the stream anymore, usually.
The book he's holding up is What's Gotten Into Us by McKay Jenkins. It's about the author, McKay Jenkins. I think he's from Delaware or Maryland, but he was diagnosed with cancer. He looked into, why did I get this diagnosis? And he, can't prove what it was from, but he, just learned from that process that, there are a lot of chemicals that we're exposed to in really routine ways, through eating canned foods, et cetera, just really those kinds of things that are carcinogens and that could be giving us cancer. One of the things he covers a good deal in the book, actually, is our Maine study, and he talks about a lot of the 13 people that we tested in Maine. And we tested, like I said, their blood and urine, and hair for a number of different chemicals. And so he profiles a lot of those people in the book and talks about those results. One of those study participants is actually in the room. Betty Cattell was one of our 13.
The best of all possible worlds, industry would have to do testing before they put a chemical out, but then you're relying on industry's data. So that's an issue. I mean, and that's come up with approval of drugs, for example. FDA is always kind of having to deal with that they're using industry's data and industry's interpretation of their data to say, yes, this drug is safe. But the thing about the precautionary principle that would be so beneficial in this country in particular, I think, is that the way things are now is that even if TSCA worked, which it doesn't, but even if it did work, we would have to prove that a particular chemical is harmful. Somebody would have to prove that, whether it's the government or a number of papers from academia or whatever, before it could be banned. or before it could be put out into commerce. I mean, depending on where that line was, depending on what the legislation was. The precautionary principle requires the opposite, and that is that the chemical has to be demonstrated to be safe before it can, to be not harmful, before it can be put out into commerce or to be put into the environment. So it's an absolute flip. The burden then is on proving safety, not proving harm. So it's you know, the kind of opposite way of looking at it.
But how can something ever be proven 100% safe? Is that even possible?
Well, no, it's not. I mean, you're right. It's not possible. But if there's an issue, if there is a question, then you go on the side of we're going to assume that it's not safe, and so we're not going to allow it out into the environment.
Yeah, and all regulation is based on reasonableness anyway. There's no blanket bans on anything. It has to be, it has to be proven reasonably safe, not perfectly safe. And often it has to be proven safer than an alternative.
When we're advocating in a regulatory setting or something, we're, challenged to think about dose, and the dose making the poison, which is an outdated way of thinking, because often it's the timing or the, various things that are actually making the poison for a particular person at a particular time. But in terms of, if you just want to think about dose, there's a great slide I've seen from the Environmental Working Group that has the levels of a couple of different chemicals they found in similar tests to what Betty went through with the body burden test to see what's in people. And they found higher levels in people in parts per billion of badge, which is a BPA breakdown product, and perfluorinated chemicals, the ones I talked about, Gore-Tex, Teflon, higher levels than you would get from a dose of Cialis, much higher levels than you would get from the NuvaRing, which is a birth control medication. And so these are chemicals that can regulate for men and women their sexual function, their reproductive function. And those doses are given at lower levels than the levels of some of these chemicals that are in our bodies right now. And so when you think about the dose making the poison, we're talking about the same kinds of doses that we're living with right now in our bodies that we're getting from drugs on purpose. I was intending to say something I heard her, previous to seeing that video, but she said it in the video, so I didn't repeat it. But that, she said she wanted to that she didn't want to write the book, because a book about pesticides would be a book about poison and death, and I wanted to write about life. And, as somebody, for instance, I work on this, it's my job, I work on this all the time, and I'm a mother of a 3- and a 4-year-old. All I want to think about is life. All I want to think about is children and healthy babies, and this is just a way to do that, thinking, so being caught up in that sense of wonder and in that desire to protect life, a really essential way to do that is just to make sure nobody else is trying to take away the ability for us to have that wonder and to have that life.
And not just you.
Right.